hence to the castle from whence you came, and from thence you shall be carried to the place of execution for this county, where your body shall be hanged until you be dead, and God have mercy on your souls.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we've got a very special Halloween episode for you. We're going to focus on the area of Pendle and the discovery of witches in the county of Lancaster. During the 17th century, a witch hunting craze swept across Europe. A genuine fear of witchcraft and cavorting with the devil invoked widespread hysteria. In England, this communal panic meant neighbours would turn against each other, that the sick would accuse their enemies of casting curses, and those in ruling power would brandish their judicial duties by taking command and banishing this wave of evil from the world. Today I will share with you the story of one of the largest witch trials in England, a tale that is so frightening, not because of spells, voodoo and pointy hats that we visualise for ourselves on Halloween, but a tale that is frightening because it really happened, and it happened to everyday people. So please sit back, relax and let the story unfold on your screen. If you enjoy the video, please hit the like button so we know it's been good. Comment with your feedback if you can and stay to the end to see a glimpse of the next episode. And if you can't sleep tonight, I am very sorry. To the east of Lancashire, rising 557 metres above sea level, there sits the isolated hill at Pendle. During the 17th century, this bleak and often lawless site was surrounded by dense forest, wild animals, and a scattering of mostly poverty-stricken inhabitants who called the area home. Today, despite being somewhat of a hiker's paradise, it continues to brood over the villages surrounding it, and with a presence of mystery, it watches silently from a distance. It's therefore the perfect but miserably real backdrop for the start of our witch story. We'll begin this narrative in the primitive home of Elizabeth Southerns and her family. Elizabeth, also known locally as Old Demdike, was at the ripe age of 80 years and lived with her widowed daughter, also Elizabeth, and her 3 children Alison, Jeanette and James. Together, this 3-generational family resided at a place called Malkin Tower. Malkin Tower, historians believe, was located somewhere in Newchurch in Pendle. Records show that a high proportion of residents in the area were wretchedly poor and uncultivated. Elizabeth and her family were of no exception. They lived together in humble surroundings with a menagerie of animals, possibly dogs, chickens, that sort of thing. As had been commonly accepted in rural England since the 16th century, the family, and especially Old Demdike, were affectionately known to be wise when it came to herbal medicine. Locals would seek out their healing knowledge for minor ailments and would affectionately refer to them as wise women or white witches. It was an ideal small business for sage old villagers like Old Demdike, and at a time when traditional doctors were unattainable, it was often the only option people could turn to. Charms, herbs and gentle spells were an accepted part of village life and had been for a long time. But those times were starting to change. Pendle, as mentioned before, was vast. It was an area considered too large to be effective in the preaching and teachings of the Church of England, and so Catholicism survived quite strongly here in 1612, despite it being illegal. Religion was a hot topic. There was an ongoing battle for religious supremacy in the country, mainly between the Catholics and the Protestants, and around 7 years prior to the witch trials in Pendle, a plan was unfoiled that, had it been successful, would have changed the course of English history. For in the year 1605, after sitting angrily and fearfully watching their kin be persecuted, a plot by the Catholics and led by Robert Catesby was hatched to kill the Protestant king James I by setting off gunpowder under the Houses of Parliament. Do subscribe to the channel if you're interested in that story, as I have something for you coming up very soon. So with that in mind, there was therefore a lot of emotion in the air. This is no doubt contributed to the events that I am about to unravel for you. The whole affair began when young Alison, the eldest granddaughter of Old Demdike, is travelling along the path near Trawden Forest. Her family, like her, were known in the area for their occupational begging, and it is on this day that Alison comes across a peddler known as John Law. John is travelling from Halifax when Alison, a young girl of around 15, 16, stops to ask him for pins. John, perhaps tired and irritated, refuses her request and begins to walk away. At this point, Alison, annoyed at not getting what she wants, mutters a barrage of verbal abuse and curses at the man who walks just a few feet before stumbling and collapsing to the floor. John, it is said, becomes lame down one side of his body. He's having trouble speaking and is generally in a lot of distress. Nowadays, we would class that as having a stroke, but in 17th century England, that wasn't something they were aware of yet. And so Alison, being horrified at what she thought she'd done, runs over to John and begins to apologise profusely, which in doing so admits her guilt of having used witchcraft against him. John, who also believes that Alison has evilly cursed him, reports the incident to a man named Roger Noel. Roger is to play a very important role in this story. Roger Noel lives in Reed Hall on the outskirts of Pendle and holds the position of Justice of the Peace. These Justices of the Peace, or JPs as they were commonly referred to, were untrained but upstanding members of the public who volunteered their time and were responsible for keeping law and order in their part of the country. Roger Noel was therefore the person that John Law reports these accusations of witchcraft to. One of Noel's jobs was to compile a list of those in the area who refused to enter the English church and take a communion, which was a criminal offence at the time. He was also expected to follow the guidance of the law. Unfortunately for Alison Device, the law at the time was governed by a king so obsessed by the idea of the devil and witchcraft that he'd even written a book about it. It is thought that James I's fear of witches intensely developed in the early 1590s, when he was convinced that there was a plot against him by a coven of Scottish witches, and just 7 years later he writes Demonology as a guide to seek out and destroy the evil of witches that he believed existed. It is therefore safe to assume that Noel would have been using James's handbook when he embarks on an investigation into these new accusations of witchcraft in his area. On the 30th of March, Alison, her mother Elizabeth, and her brother James are summoned to appear before Noel to discuss what exactly had happened to the peddler. Alison, who is most likely ignorant to the severity of the situation, immediately confesses to the accusation of cursing John using witchcraft. She concocts this fantastic story about how she'd sold her soul to the devil, and that in the form of a black dog it lamed John because she had asked him to do it when the peddler had called her a thief. Nowadays we might assume this kind of a story of dramatic fantasy from a teenage girl who was all of a sudden getting a lot of attention, but in 1612 superstitious beliefs were common, especially amongst the lower and rural classes. Alison and her family would have put a lot of faith in the charms they used in everyday life, and while some magic can be for good, as happens with balance, there must be an element of evil. Reports from the age suggest that people here believed that the devil was most definitely living amongst them. They believed there were hares upon the moors that could never be caught, and that dark forces or spirits could appear in solid forms, in most cases as an animal. In the instances of witches, as advised by James I's handbook, there were several ways that they could be identified. One of these was the presence of witch marks, a mark that had supposedly been put on the witch's body by the devil himself. These marks were the entry points that demonic creatures called familiars could suckle on in order to be fed by the witch. These familiars would commonly appear as cats, mice, rats or dogs, and so when Alison admits to a black dog being at the scene of the falling of the peddler, she's created even more evidence against herself. James, her brother, in the room whilst all this is going on, confirms the story to Noel. There's no family loyalty here, as he even adds to the story that his sister has previously bewitched a local child too. Her mother Elizabeth neither confirms nor defends the evidence against her daughter, but instead mentions that her mother, Old Demdike, does in fact have a mark on her body. Noel at this point must have been overwhelmed by the information he'd discovered, and by the end of the meeting, Alison, perhaps thinking she's going to get off more lightly, drags the name of another villager into the mix. She accuses a lady by the name of Anne Whittle, aka Old Chattox, of also being a witch. She claims Chattox has bragged locally to having murdered 5 men by witchcraft, including Alison's own father, John Device. We now know that Old Chattox's family and Old Demdike's family had been at neighbourly war for years, perhaps in part to them being in competition with one another. The records show that Old Chattox was also known locally for selling spells and charms. This business rivalry and the accusation that Chattox had once robbed items from Malkin Tower is perhaps the reason why both families were thrown into this bubbling pot together. On the 2nd of April, Noel summons both Old Demdike, Old Chattox and Anne Redfern, Chattox's daughter, to a meeting. Perhaps in their haste to outdo each other, both almost blind 80-year-old ladies provide damaging confessions. We know they believed in their powers of healing, and maybe they used this space as a chance to air their skills by competitively suggesting each was more powerful than the other. Demdike claims she gave her soul to the devil more than 20 years ago, and that it comes to her as a familiar named Tib. Chattox retorts that she also has a familiar, just as magical as Tib, and that hers is named Fancy. Anne, the daughter, at this point confesses nothing, but no doubt to her horror is accused by her mother's enemy Demdike of making clay figures in the image of people in order to cause them harm. This dramatic addition is backed up by a villager called Margaret Crook, who claims her brother had fallen sick and died after an argument with Anne. By this point, with Demonology Handbook by his side, Noel has enough information and he commits Demdike, Chattox, Anne Redfern and Alison to Lancaster Jail to await trial. 50 years previously, and early in her reign, Queen Elizabeth I had passed a law in the form of the Witchcraft Act of 1562. It demanded that anyone who should use, practice or exercise any witchcraft, enchantment, charm or sorcery, whereby any person shall happen to be killed or destroyed, was guilty and should be put to death. This journey to Lancaster Jail was therefore a most ominous one indeed for all 4 of the women involved. Back home in Pendle, possibly keen to discuss what was happening to their kin over in Lancaster, the family, now headed by Elizabeth Device, calls a meeting at Malkin Tower on Good Friday. It is at this point the story takes an even more dramatic spike, and it's interesting to think, had Elizabeth known what the outcome would be, whether she would have thought twice about hosting such a party. For the event, young James Device steals a sheep for them to eat, and friends or people sympathetic to the family's crisis attend the meeting. Also in attendance is a lady by the name of Jeanette Preston. Jeanette had recently faced similar charges of witchcraft at York Jail and had been released. It is now thought that she had attended in order to give some advice about what the incarcerated family members could expect. Unfortunately, the news of this meeting at Malkin Tower whispered across Pendle, and the existence of it becomes known to Roger Noel. For Noel, who by this point must have been enthralled by the notion that the devil and witches were infesting the area, believing this meeting to be, without doubt, a conjuring of evil deeds. Before this event at Malkin Tower, never had it been alleged that witches had gathered in England for ritual meetings, but without haste Noel is convinced that he is dealing with a witches' Sabbath. The group are accused of magically flying in on spirits, offering curses together, and planning an elaborate plan to blow up Lancaster Castle by the means of witchcraft. Noel, together with another magistrate, Nicholas Bannister, determines that a witches' Sabbath has indeed taken place at Malkin Tower, and as a result 8 more people are now accused. Elizabeth Device, James Device, Alice Nutter, Catherine Hewitt, John Bullock, Jane Bullock and Alice Gray are sent to Lancaster Jail, and Jeanette Preston is to return to the York Jail that she's only just been freed from. Lancaster Jail is a medieval castle and prison around 51 miles from Pendle. The accused were all forced to walk from their homes through the Ribble Valley and the forest of Bowland. Today, tourists can retrace their steps in a trail that takes them through stunning scenery and along isolated tracks. By the time the accused arrived in Lancaster, I think it's fair to assume they would have been exhausted and weary from their travelling. But there is no respite, as on arrival they are crammed together in a dark and depressing dungeon where they were expected to wait until their inevitable trial, which would be held with another group of people suspecting of being witches. Lancaster Castle has a dark, monumental past, and its foreboding entrance would be enough to send shivers down any prisoner's spine. A place of defence, justice, persecution and imprisonment, it is now said that more prisoners have been sentenced to death at Lancaster Castle than any other court in the country, giving the city of Lancaster the nickname of the Hanging Town. These witch trials that take place here are to become known in history as the most important of the castle's past. The cell that our prisoners were to have been kept in will have been a simple enclosed room, locked up in darkness by a thick bolted door. A scattering of straw on the floor would have acted as both carpeting and toilet, and therefore the air would have been damp with odour and bodily stench. As a result of this captivity, old Demdike, in her aged years of 80, dies before even making trial. The rest of the accused would no doubt be in such a state by the time their judgment day came that many historians believe they would have not been fit medically or mentally to stand trial in a modern court today. In the meantime, Jeanette, who has been sent to York, is found guilty and is executed for her crime on the 29th of July 1612 in an area that would now be located near York Racecourse. In Lancaster for 2 days beginning on the 18th of August, the accused were brought forward to meet their judgment. All are denied witnesses to plead their innocence, and instead what happens next is most remarkable, and one of the reasons this trial in particular is to become momentous in history. For the key witness for the prosecution in the case of the Witches of Pendle is that of 9-year-old Jeanette Device, the granddaughter of old Demdike and youngest daughter of Elizabeth Device. She is there to prosecute against her family, including her 2 siblings, Alison and James. This using of a child witness was something that would not have been permitted in many other 17th century criminal trials, but King James I had made a case for suspending normal rules of evidence for witch trials in his old faithful Demonology Guide. I think you'll agree by now it's got quite a lot to answer for. We're still not quite sure why Jeanette does what she does next. Some reports have suggested that perhaps with her whole family in jail, she's been tactically groomed by senior officials. Whatever the backstory is, she plays a most remarkable part in court. Small in stature as can be expected by her tiny age, Jeanette is put on a table in front of the crowded courtroom and is to testify with damning outcome of the guilt of those accused. Here she confidently declares that her mother has been a witch 3 or 4 years and had a familiar called Ball, who had helped with her various murders. Elizabeth, at this point having been accused by her young daughter, begins to curse and scream at her, with a result that sees the judge have her removed from the courtroom. Adding further insult to her motherly role, her son James also confirms his sister's statement by suggesting Elizabeth had in fact made a clay figure of one of her victims in order to manifest harm upon them. Jeanette continues with her dramatic representation and identifies each member of the accused as having been present at the proposed Witches' Sabbath at Malkin Tower. Regardless of whether her 9-year-old mind could comprehend what was unfolding, with this final moment of betrayal, she concludes the last piece of evidence against them all. And so on the 19th of August 1612, 9 of the accused are found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Elizabeth Device is charged with murder by witchcraft. Her son James, using his previous confession to Noel and a statement from his sister that he'd asked a black dog to kill somebody, is also found guilty. The confession of old Chattox, which is most likely to have been obtained during torture, was used against her too. She was accused of stealing teeth and skulls from the graveyard in Newchurch to make clay dolls, and of having turned the milk sour and causing death to her neighbours. The church in Newchurch still stands, and when visiting today you can see the evil eye that has supposedly been created to ward off any further attempts of witchcraft in the area. After giving her own evidence, Chattox breaks down, admits her guilt and asks they be merciful to her daughter Anne, which they are not. Anne, who has refused to admit guilt from the get-go, has no evidence against her other than the previous statement made by Demdike. She is also sentenced to death. It's important to point out that throughout this event, Anne did not once turn on, accuse or give evidence against any of the others that stood trial. I think that speaks volumes. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Jane and John Bulcock were too found guilty. The married pair had denied being at the Malkin Tower meeting, but were subsequently identified by lovely little Jeanette. Jeanette claims they were both present, and that John had in fact been the one to turn the roasted lamb on the spit for the feast. Catherine Hewitt, who had also been identified as being at the meeting, is furthermore damned by James, who gives evidence that together with Alice Gray, they had bragged about killing a child. Although Catherine is sentenced to death, Alice is not. Alice Gray is the only person to be found not guilty. I'm still not quite sure why, as the evidence against her seems as strong as the others. Perhaps the judge felt he needed to let at least one of them go. I'm not sure. Let me know in the comments what you think. Next in line is Alice Nutter. Nutter becomes immortalised in history, as some say she was the worst victim of the witch trial in Pendle. Unlike the others, Alice Nutter is a respectable, somewhat wealthy widow of a tenant yeoman farmer. We're not quite sure how she got dragged into all this mess, but some believe that Roger Nowell had a long-standing grudge against her over a disputed boundary. The evidence against her is the theatrical lineup in court, where Jeanette picks her out as having been present at the Malkin Tower meet. Throughout the process, Alice Nutter made no statement except to plead not guilty. Some believe she did perhaps attend the meeting, maybe to offer some kind words to her suffering neighbours. Others think she may have called in on her way to a secret and illegal Good Friday Catholic service, and the reason she refused to speak at the trial was for fear of incriminating her fellow Catholics. She was sentenced to death with the others, and now all that remains of her is a statue commemorating her story. This poignant sculpture sits by the roadside in roughly Pendle, a lasting reminder of the cruelty she ensued. Last but not least, we finish where we started, with the teenage Alison Device. She is the only one to openly confess all guilt, and when John Law the peddler is brought into the courtroom, she fell to her knees in tears, believing in her own power against him. And so the group are taken on their final journey to the gallows hill that looms atop Lancaster. Today they built a memorial in the place where they believe most of the hangings took place. I wonder, as this solemn group, seated upon their empty coffin boxes in the cart that would carry them to the gallows, what they would have felt. They would be sat across from each other, having spent the last few months in a tandem battle of blame, pointing fingers and concocting stories against their neighbours in a desperate attempt to free themselves from their own condemnation. Were the tension still high? Was the hatred of one another still raw? Or did they end this final journey in despondency, now knowing that none of it had brought any goodness to them? Also knowing that their fate had in the end been sealed by the evidence of a small child some had called sister. The events here in Lancashire will go on to have a direct influence on future witch trials. For here, a chilling precedence was set by allowing a child to stand as witness. And so, as merchants and Puritans start to spread across the water to America, we find it's not just supplies they take with them, but their laws and witch-crazed ideas. Where the events in Pendle will, around 80 years later, reenact once again, but this time the backdrop of the story isn't Pendle Hill, it's the prospering farming area of Salem, Massachusetts. Thank you everybody for watching. Happy Halloween. Let me know what you're doing. Please do like and subscribe, for next time we'll be in York, walking in the footsteps of Guy Fawkes.